Crum, everybody.
In the midst of life, we are in death. From whom can we seek help? Our help comes in the name of the Lord. I was raised in a religious household of parents who, one was a math teacher and the other an engineer with IBM. And they would faithfully take us to church, a United Methodist church. I felt like it almost every waking minute. So we'd go and, you learn the stories, and sometimes you'd say, like, what do you think happened to the children on that boat that were waving at Noah? And there were never satisfactory answers to that, but for me, like, somehow in the midst of all of those other stories, I got this message that, like, God loves you, and therefore you're supposed to love all of your neighbors, and you share this message with them. And somehow in the midst of all of that, like, I felt like when I was in high school, I really needed to ask God whether I needed to be a minister. And so I did that, and I was on this youth retreat, and I was praying to God, like, please just give me a sign. And sure enough, an older woman came up to me, and she put her hand on my shoulder, and she said, young man, I just want to tell you, God has great things planned for you. And I'm pretty sure she was an employee who did that every half hour. But I didn't think about that at the time. And so I was like, got my marching orders, I'm going, right? So, I went to school, I studied religion and philosophy, and I was a little bit too academic to take it all seriously. But I did, and then I went on to say, I think I will do this work in the church. And I did sort of like progressive work where I was doing like conflict resolution work in the Middle East. I was not fully successful there. And then, when the Intifada started, they were like, well, we'll send you to Belfast for a little bit, and, for downtime. And the nice thing was in Belfast, they did have good beer. And so, that was good, and I'd spent some time in England, so I knew what the food was like and everything. Which is not as bad as some people say. So I did that, and then I actually said, okay, I'm gonna be a minister. So I was fully trained and was sent to pastor churches in rural Alabama, in small town Alabama, where they did not really appreciate my line of thinking. Except for the fact that I would listen patiently as they would tell me about all their medicines that they were taking, because it was an old congregation, and I actually was in this church for just shy of 3 years, so 35 months, and I did 36 funerals. Wow. Which is how I got so good at knowing, in the midst of life, we are in death. And eventually I realized, this is not, listen, I believe this. I believe that God loves us. I believe we were called to love one another. I'm not trying to sell you on that. I realized, the thing was, for me, I thought it, but I didn't really care whether you did. And so I realized, I always liked working with kids, and I said, I want to become a teacher. And I remember actually being at a party with a bunch of other preachers at one point, and one spouse said to us, they said, if you weren't a preacher, what would you be? And every single one of them had an immediate answer. Every single one of them. And I said then, I'll be a teacher. And so when I got the chance to leave, I was like, I'm going to be a teacher. And what's interesting is I come from actually a line of teachers. My mom was a high school math teacher. My grandmother was a high school math teacher. I have an aunt who was a high school math teacher. So now I teach that guy's daughter math in elementary school. And the thing about math, and sometimes people will say hey, what do you do? And I'll be I'm just a teacher. And that's my fake humble answer. It's yes, you do underpay me. The work is hard, but the cringe benefits of parents complaining about like an S in conduct is, I mean, it's worth every penny. So, in reality though, so I became a teacher and I realized, like, as I started thinking about math and like growing up in elementary school and realizing like so many of the kids that I was in school with did not have an understanding about what our math teachers were teaching us. They didn't know it because all of us in this audience were taught simply how to solve algorithms. So it's just like, let me show you how to solve a problem, right? So you line up the digits and you add them up and you regroup this one to the next column. I don't really know why, but we do it to the next one and we do it here and we do it. We have no idea why we do it. And it's why people will stop me and say, oh man, you teach math. I hate math. And my response to them is, you weren't in Mr. Crum's classroom. Because here's why. Here's what's so cool about numbers. I get tears. Here's the thing, right? What happens is, when you add up, right? When you take a 3 and a 7, and you put them together, right? You're combining them. And it makes 1 10. Right? And that's why we regroup. You guys are looking this way. That's why we regroup to the tens place. And then what's amazing is we take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 tens, and we bundle them together, and it makes 100, right? And then we do the same thing with hundreds. We take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and we bundle them together, and it makes 1,000. And the amazing thing is, when kids start realizing that math is not lame, that it is about like looking for and finding patterns and solving problems, that they're just like, oh my God, this is really cool. And yesterday, as I was trying to teach a couple of kids, we draw these fractions, right? So a fraction, all kids know, and you might, is part of a whole. Now, the denominator, which we knew as the bottom number of the fraction, tells us the parts that we split the whole up into. And then the numerator, that's the top part, they're using all of these words, by the way. And they can define them. The numerator, which is the top part, tells us how many copies of that part we have. And what we're doing over the last few days is to figure out something that we have no idea how to do, except that somebody told us, just do it this way, right? If you're adding 1/2 and 1/3, and you realize you do not have the same units, how to turn 1/2 and 1/3 into things that have the same unit. And so we draw a little box. Just like this. We draw a box. We say, well, if I have one whole, how many cuts do I need to make to have halves? And the kids are so excited. 1! All right, let's draw a line right down the middle. And now we've got 1/2 and the other half, right? And we shade in 1/2 of that square. And they do the same thing with 1/3. And they say, how many lines should we draw on 1/3? They'll say 2, right? Because they know how to cut cake. So they got, okay, if we want 1/3, great. So we color in 1/3 of it. And then what we figure out is the halves and the thirds each share a common multiple. It's 6. We find it together. And guess what? When you've shaded in 1/2, if you draw 2 horizontal lines coming across the other direction, you turn 1/2 into 3/6. And if you take 1/3 and you cut one line across in this direction, you turn 1/3 into 2/6. And then you can add like units. That's where I'm going.